though. But slowly, when I chose hepatology and gastroenterology, I had to, get into it, and slowly it became a passion for me. And I've been dealing with metabolic liver disorders for quite a number of years now. Earlier, if I say metabolic liver disorders have, in a way, evolved in the knowledge aspect also, and as well as the investigation part. Earlier, what used to happen was that the child who would be labeled as neonatal hepatitis or neonatal cholestasis would just be labeled then cryptogenic or idiopathic, or all these terms used to be used. Now, I think as the science is progressing, we are now into an era in which we are diagnosing more cases of metabolic liver disorders, and more specific diagnosis can be given, and due to this we can give better counseling to the parents, and also tell if there is any kind of treatment, or also helps us in genetic counseling of the parents, that how much it's likely that the next child can have the problem. And all those things are getting settled now, because we do have better diagnosis to give as per the investigations are concerned now that we can do. And so we can make a better diagnosis of metabolic liver disorders. So in this presentation, I will just initially go through how to kind of approach a metabolic liver disorder suspected child, when to suspect, how to suspect, what sort of a thought process should be there. And then I'll be just presenting few cases, and in that I would like to make things more elaborate and slightly go into a little bit of detail, but not extend it too much. So let's start the presentation. So if we see, most of the times, as I'm into liver transplant for quite a number of years, so most common reason for transplant is usually biliary atresia, and then comes the metabolic liver disorders. And in India, if you see what are the kind of metabolic liver disorders that we usually diagnose, earlier on it used to be only Wilson's disease, galactosemia. Now NASH is also coming in, Gaucher's, MPS, familial hyperlipoproteinemias. But if this is I think 5-6 year old paper in which these causes were written, but I would say nowadays what we are diagnosing is more of children coming with cholestasis are like PFIC1, PFIC2, PFIC3, and galactosemia, tyrosinemias, and GSDs, and various other. So here I would like to mention that don't go by carbohydrate metabolic defects, lipid metabolic defects, they don't categorize according to the metabolic defects. I would like to categorize in a different way, which I'll show you in the next slide. So here what you can categorize is that if there is an involvement of the liver, if there is no involvement of the liver, or the presentation is like that extrahepatic presentation is there and the hepatic involvement does occur in them, or it is predominantly in the hepatic presentation and you have extrahepatic manifestations also, and also only liver involvement. So first category, if you can see here, there is no liver involvement. A metabolic liver disorder with no liver involvement would be, let's say, urea cycle defect or organic acidemias like proponic acidemias, MMAs, and Kliger-Nazar syndrome, in which you have neurological problems. These children do not present as a liver problem, but they present as neurological problems like altered sensorium, high ammonia, seizures, developmental delays, something like that. And they present quite early in the life. And organic acidemias are good choice for doing liver transplant. Kliger-Nazar also the treatment of choice is liver transplant. So this is one of the categories in which there is no liver involvement. So the second category, as I told you, predominantly systemic disease with liver involvement. So the child will have more of systemic problem rather than the liver problem, but can have the liver problem later on in life. So initially, like in cystic fibrosis and alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, you will find more of a chest infections, recurrent type chest infections happening, and later on they will have they can have in second, third decade after the chest infections, if the child survives actually after the first 2 decades, then the child can have some liver issues. I'll go into detail later on. Then the third category, as I mentioned, predominantly liver involvement with other organs. So here the problem starts in the liver and the spleen, and then it spreads to the other places. In for example, GM1, GM2, and Niemann-Pick's disease. Here what you can see, a child comes with hepatosplenomegaly initially, and after a few years you might find that the child starts having deterioration in form of neurological deterioration, developmental delay, regression of milestones. So then it becomes clear that probably this was this category of diseases. And the last but not the least, the most interesting part is the early, only the liver involvement is there. The category in which only the liver involvement is there, you can categorize into early infancy and those diseases which are presenting later on. So in early infancy, I would say if you get a child in first 1 month of life with cholestasis, with liver failure, I would say remember 3, 4 or 5 diagnoses: galactosemia, tyrosinemia, PFIC, GSD4, and hemochromatosis. These 4 or 5 diseases need to be remembered. If you see any child with acute liver failure in first month of life, these would be the most probable diagnosis that would come out to be. This was what I learned in AIIMS when there was a case, I remember, a 3 or 4 day old child who had acute liver failure, was bleeding from everywhere, was in encephalopathy and in very bad shape. In evening, Dr. Madhuvikalika Kabra, who was a genetist at AIIMS, she came. I was a resident in those days, and she said, this is one of these 4, and I still remember those words: galactosemia, tyrosinemia, GSD4, and hemochromatosis. And I'm adding PFIC to that because PFIC also can present there. So galactosemia, tyrosinemia, GSD4, and hemochromatosis. 1 month, less than 1 month old child presenting to you with acute liver failure. Just remember these 4 diagnoses. One of these would be the most likely diagnosis. And then later on, as you know, Wilson's disease can present. Most commonly, Wilson's disease presents after 5 years of life, and likewise GSD1 and GSD2 presents in the later part of life. So this is a broad categorization which I would suggest that it gives us a more clinical approach to when the child comes, how the child is coming, how is it presenting, what is the age. So, and whether the symptoms are predominantly of liver or it is extrahepatic presentation. So this can just give us a broad idea of what kind of diseases we should be thinking. Now, when to suspect metabolic liver disorders? As you all know, whenever we find consanguinity or a sibling death, recurrent episodes of jaundice, you should be suspecting that there might be some connection with metabolic liver disorders. Plus, as I mentioned, developmental delay and regression of milestones. If a child comes with developmental delay, regression of milestones, this can very well be GM1, GM2, Niemann-Pick's disease. So keep all this in mind, that even if you have a neurological problem or only neurological problem, then you can have urocycle defects or Crigler-Najjar syndrome. So you should not just focus unless we have a liver involvement, then only we'll think of metabolic liver disorders. Even in children with regression of milestones or developmental delay, there should be metabolic liver disorders should be kept in mind. And of course, if you have large liver and spleen without jaundice, also can be a liver disorder. Just like in GSD, you might find a huge hepatomegaly, an isolated hepatomegaly, huge hepatomegaly. I would say without jaundice, more likely to be a GSD. A storage disorder would be more likely in such a case. Plus, rickets and failure to thrive. If a child is having rickets, I would say most of these metabolic disorders have renal tubular acidosis, which leads to rickets. So if you have a vitamin D resistant kind of rickets and you're saying that, okay, this child is having rickets, and if you work up the child, if you find RTA, then the connection with tyrosiniemias, galactosemias, GSDs, it all comes into picture. So you have to keep in mind rickets also can be a presenting symptom for any metabolic liver disorder, large liver or developmental delay, recurrent episodes, sibling death, consanguinity, and of course, last but not least, hypoglycemia, recurrent hypoglycemia, refractory hypoglycemia, of course you need to suspect metabolic liver disorder in such a scenario in which you get a mix up of all these, one of all these. So you have to just keep metabolic liver disorder in some corner of your mind, that whenever you get any kind of all this, any of these presentations, if you have that suspicion, do work up in those lines. Now, if you see how these metabolic liver disorder they present in various ways. They might present as acute liver failure, like in Wilson's disease. Wilson's disease, you will not find a child coming to you with the chronic liver disease and you find out, okay, this is a Wilson's. Wilson's usually presents as an acute liver failure, most of the times. And I would say, if I have a case of chronic liver disease who's been following up, it would be a sibling who might have been diagnosed because we had done a family screen of a child who was diagnosed as Wilson's because he presented in an acute liver failure condition. And there can be other presentations like Ray's syndrome, usually sometimes encephalopathy, as I mentioned, urea cycle defects can present as encephalopathy. And cholestasis, as you all know, cholestasis is one of the major presentations. Neonatal cholestasis is the most common presentation, I would say. And any sick child who is not getting explained by any other thing, infection is not getting explained, and you find some lactic acidosis going on, hypoglycemia going on, child is sick, and the infection is not the explanation, then you should think in those lines of a metabolic liver disease. And large liver and spleen, as I explained in the previous slide. Now, why does if we see what goes wrong in these metabolic liver disorders, there's a congenital deficiency of any enzyme, or there's a nutritional deficiency, or there's an excess of the substrate, or there's the substrate that is formed is toxic, it is damaging the liver, or there's a chemical damage to the organelles of the liver cells. So this is why the liver gets damaged, because of some storage disorder causes damage to the organelles, some other causes bile acid getting clogged inside the hepatocytes, that causes damage. Sometimes tyrosinemia, the substrates that are formed, they cause toxic damage to these cells. So all have different type of presentations, and the reason is different in each of them for whatever they present. Now, as you all know, this amino acid, you can categorize, the classical way of categorizing MLDs would be amino acid metabolic defects, bile acid metabolic defects, carbohydrate metabolic defects, bile acid flow and excretion defects, mitochondrial, peroxisomal, copper metals. This is the classical way of categorizing. But rather than this, I would suggest the categorization that I had suggested a little while back. That would be a little more clinical approach to any metabolic liver disease. Now, if you see, if you do a liver biopsy in these cases, you might not find anything. You might not find a diagnostic, what you call diagnostic or pathogenomic findings in liver biopsy. What you will find is, in all these metabolic liver disorders, they lead to chronic liver disease, which leads to sometimes there's ballooning of the cells. Sometimes you can find some storage cells, but most of the times when you do the liver biopsy, you might find necrosis, cirrhosis, sometimes tumors are formed. But these do not give you, liver biopsy does not really help in getting the final diagnosis. Yes, if you get some storage, glycogen storage, you might get some classical picture, but most of the times it is just a cholestatic picture with apoptosis, with necrosis, cirrhotic changes, and nothing beyond that. So liver biopsy actually would not be a help in metabolic liver diseases, but we need to do to understand whatever best information we can get. Now, if we go into various diseases like alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, I would say 20 years down the line, in 2000, we used to screen alpha-1 antitrypsin in our country. But after a lot of discussions and meetings and some papers, we never it was concluded that alpha-1 antitrypsin as such doesn't exist in our country. So this one particular diagnosis is out of the picture as of now when we see a child of an Indian origin. Yes, when we see a child from Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, or African origin, or UAE and all, we tend to do the investigation for alpha-1 antitrypsin, but not in child who is from the Indian origin. It is out of the list when we talk of a child who is from India. As I'm talking of it, I'll just briefly tell you about it. Alpha-1 antitrypsin and cystic fibrosis, as I categorized in one, in which the chest infections are more, and later on they can have some liver issues later on in life, maybe second decade or third decade if they live that long. Alpha-1 antitrypsin, almost like 10 to 12% patients can develop some liver disease, and out of those 10-12%, almost 25% have initial chronic liver disease, and almost 50% resolve, and 25% can worsen. So out of those small 10 to 12% children who can develop liver disease and they have an underlying alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, they are very unlikely to actually present as liver disease to us. It might present later on in life. So no point, getting into that. The cystic fibrosis, yes, we all would have seen, and usually presents with recurrent chest infections, pseudomonas infections, bronchiectasis can happen later on, diarrheas can happen, and malnutrition. But in this also, the liver gets involved maybe in the second or the third decade of life. And when the liver gets involved, you'll find some cholestasis happening, some bilirubin rising, OTPT is getting OTPT is getting deranged, and in liver biopsy of cystic fibrosis, you might find inspissated bile. So inspissated bile in liver biopsy, if we find, it would be a diagnosis of cystic fibrosis, and plus the other signs of recurrent chest infections and other clinical picture will be suggestive. You have to do the mutations and all, and sweat chloride test, and you can get to the diagnosis. Here, if I would like to mention that when we talk of cystic fibrosis, liver transplant is advised in a very late stage when we need to do a combined lung and liver transplant both, because chest is going to go into bronchiectasis. There's no point doing liver transplant early on in life when there is no involvement. So second, third decade of life, all these kind of presentations happen. The lung goes into bronchiectasis, and we keep waiting till the point lung transplant comes into picture. So lung liver combined transplant is the choice of treatment later on in life if the child actually survives that long. So just this much about these two things, these two diseases. Now, just first case I will discuss. This was a 2-day-old child with acute liver failure with bilirubin of 14 and direct of 10 and OTPT around 600, 800s and 600 and 400s, and INR was very high, 4.6, which is very bad, and bleeding from gums and manila. This is the same case that I discussed just when I was presenting the various kind of categorizations that I was suggesting, and this was the actual child. Dr. Madhulika asked us to send all kind of samples and all, but unfortunately on the next day the child had worsened, and in those days I'm talking about around 2000 facilities were there, and unfortunately after 2 days the child expired, and I am not sure what the diagnosis was, but still those 4 diagnoses I will still keep here, and I would want you to remember galactosemia, tyrosinemia, GSD4 and iron storage disorders in form of hemochromatosis. So these 4 diagnoses would be there. Now, in this next case, this was a 10-month-old female child who presented with jaundice from day 8 of life, and there was itching, but there was no clay-colored stools, and there was hepatomegaly. What would be coming in your mind? Any suggestions? Anything anyone would want to say about this case? What would be the diagnosis, probable diagnosis, or?
Basically, it is direct hyperbilirubinemia, which is causing itching and all.
Yeah.
So just have to focus, and primarily the presentation is not suggestive of hepatitis to that extent. So we'll again be thinking of metabolic disorders,
Right.
which can do direct hyperbilirubinemia.
Yeah. So, as rightly said, we did
PFI would be a diagnosis to think about it.
Right. So here
Hello?
we have the investigation. So bilirubin was 6.7, direct of 4.7, OTPT is around 800 and 600, GGT was 34, cholesterol was 156, alkaline phosphatase was 434. Do we reach a diagnosis here? Just looking at these investigations.
Hello.
Yeah.
I think PFIC would be a feasible
Yeah.
diagnosis. Such
Yeah, absolutely correct. Because the GGTP is not high.
Yes.
So PFIC is one diagnosis, PFIC 1 and PFIC 2 would be the best possible diagnosis in a child who is itching and has been having some cholestasis going on since birth. And so first possible diagnosis would be PFIC 1 and or 2, because in first and PFIC 1 and 2, this is what happens. You do not find a GGT being raised. In PFIC 3, we find rise in the GGT. So if we talk of PFIC, as discussed, PFIC can present it from neonates. It usually presents around, let's say, 10 months of age or 8 months of age, or even later. But classical, what all I have seen is children do present with a lot of itching. Itching is very classical in PFIC. They have conjugated bilirubin and they keep itching. They have so much of scratches all over the body. They become almost black with all scratches all over the body. So a child who is itching with conjugated bilirubin with low GGTP, we should always suspect PFIC.
तो फिर हम कहाँ मिले तुम लोग को?
If we see how can you differentiate between PFIC 1, PFIC 2 and PFIC 3, liver biopsy, and that too electron microscopy of liver biopsy, not a normal liver biopsy. Normal liver biopsy will just show you cholestasis and features of fibrosis and cirrhosis and all chronicity changes you'll find. But on electron microscopy, PFIC will show you granular bile, and PFIC 2 will show filamentous bile. And one problem with PFIC 1 is that surgeons don't like to do transplant in PFIC 1 children. Why they don't want to transplant in PFIC 1 is, in PFIC 1, usually the child develops diarrhea post-transplant. Now, why that happens? This happens because the expression of the PFIC gene is also in the intestines in a child who is having PFIC 1. So what happens here is, once you get a normal liver after transplant, the bile starts coming into the intestines. And now, because the bile is coming into the intestines and the expression of the gene is also there in the intestines are not going to absorb the bile salts. So that's the reason that the bile keeps going into the stool, and that's the reason why diarrhea starts happening. And this is very, very bad situation, and it becomes a very refractory kind of diarrhea, which is very difficult to handle. So in a PFIC child, PFIC 1, diarrhea is a complication of transplant. But this does not happen at PFIC 2, because the expression of the gene is only in the liver. So post-transplant PFIC 2 children tend to be okay. And in PFIC3, the characteristic thing about it is that there are recurrent gallstones that keep happening. So, although the diagnosis of PFIC 1, 2, 3 depends on the mutation that the child has, which needs to be tested out, and we do this clinical exome sequencing in which we can pick up which of the diagnosis it is actually. Now, once we have discussed PFIC 1, 2, 3, there is also BRIC1, BRIC2. You must have heard about BRIC1 and BRIC2. This is benign recurrent intrahepatic cholestasis 1 and benign recurrent intrahepatic cholestasis 2. These two disorders, BRIC1 and PFIC1, have the same mutation. PFIC2 and BRIC2 have the same mutation. Right? But these are the two extremes of the phenotypic presentation. PFIC is the worst form and BRIC1 is the best form, and same with PFIC1 BRIC2. PFIC2 and BRIC2. In BRIC1 and BRIC2, usually they do not present in the first decade of life. They usually start presenting in second decade of life, and they do not present in a very bad state. They just have severe cholestasis. The bilirubin might increase to 50, 60, 70. Recently, I had seen a child who come to Max who was around Satarji's child and around 13-year-old child who presented with severe itching and cholestasis of for last maybe 15-20 days, and his bilirubin was 50 at that point of time, and we didn't do anything, and it settled down on its own. But the problem with BRIC1, BRIC2 is that it can be a recurrent problem. Jaundice comes, itching comes, goes on for a month or two, and then it settles down on its own, comes back again, then settles down on its own, then comes back again, and then settles down on its own. So differentiating from an autoimmune hepatitis becomes difficult, because autoimmune hepatitis you also find recurrent episodes of jaundice and all happening. It settles down on its own and all. And sometimes they get misdiagnosed as autoimmune hepatitis or other autoimmune disorders. BRIC1 and 2 usually are triggered after some viral infections, after some URI and all, and they can present to you in this way. So there's a thin line where you need to decide whether we really need to do something or not. So we did not do anything. And the child is now settling down. Now its bilirubin has come down to 12 or so, and now it's better. And this was the second episode. So in first episode, obviously nobody can predict what it is. This was the second episode, and it was triggered by a viral infection 15-20 days back, and now again it's going into that phase in which it's settling down. Drug-induced liver injury, DILI that we call, can also present as BRIC1 and 2. They can have the same liver biopsy picture, and they can have the same presentation. So a history of any drug, Ayurvedic drug, Homeopathic drug, which can be a leading factor for liver damage, should also be ruled out when you are thinking of a BRIC1 or BRIC2. So now, I will not discuss too much of bile acid synthesis defect. There are almost 9 types of bile acid synthesis defects. The cholesterol, the various defects in which there are 9 enzymes involved, and there are various steps in which this problem can happen, and mutation in any of the enzyme leads to this bile acid synthesis defect. And this, in this category also, there is a lot of cholestasis, and not a good disease to have. Now this is the case 3. This was a 9-year-old child who presented to me in afternoon, and with some jaundice for last 10-15 days. And so first impression was like, and he was sitting in front of me, he was fine, nothing happening to him, and I thought maybe it's just a hepatitis A or viral hepatitis that would have happened. So I just wrote some investigations, CBC, LFT, PTINR. And to my surprise, after 2 hours, when father brought the reports, bilirubin was 7.2, with most of it was direct, OTPT was 700 and 800s, and INR was 4.6. So INR of 4.6 is really was really shocking for me, and I asked the patient father to get the child admitted because he was in acute liver failure during that time, although was sitting, and by evening, you can see the reports. By 2 a.m. in the night, the child has crashed immensely. From 7.2, the bilirubin went up to 21 in the night. And OTPTs were 700 and 300, 600, 200, 400, 150. So OTPTs were also on the right, on a higher side, but they were decreasing, and the INR was increasing. Because the INR was increasing from 4.6 and it had increased to 6.1, and the OTPTs were falling, this, and with the bilirubin increasing, this is a fulminant hepatic failure. Here the liver, there's nothing left in the liver. That's why the OTPTs are coming down, bilirubin increasing, and PTINR increasing. So fulminant hepatic failure, which is totally gone. By night, the child was going into encephalopathy, had to be intubated, and overnight we had to call. This child had come from Kolkata actually, and overnight we had to call the uncle of the child for liver transplant, and he had flown there from there in a chartered flight at 4 o'clock, and he reached Delhi around 6-7 o'clock, and he reached hospital around 9 o'clock. In 2-3 hours, liver transplant donor assessment was done, and by afternoon we had taken the child for the liver transplant. Now, what would be the diagnosis in this child? The underlying diagnosis. Why this happened? Was it hepatitis A, acute liver failure, chronic liver disease? What would the best diagnosis here? Any suggestions? As I discussed in the...
It can be, it can be a case of underlying metabolic liver disease, which may be another episode of second insult by hepatitis virus. And that is why the child is deteriorating so fast.
Yeah, you're absolutely right in that. But what would be that chronic liver disease that you're suspecting, metabolic liver disease that you're suspecting? 9-year-old child was fine earlier, suddenly falls ill and becomes, goes into fulminant hepatic failure.
Maybe Wilson with...
absolutely correct. That's what I wanted to hear. This is Wilson's. No, not as I had mentioned earlier. Wilson's is one disease which actually presents as acute liver failure. It doesn't present as a chronic liver disease. It just presents first time as a surprise, and it comes in to us. Any child presenting to us in acute liver failure after 5 years of life, my first diagnosis would be Wilson's. But there can be other chronic liver diseases in which you might find a top-up infection of hepatitis A, which actually crashes the child and goes into hepatic failure. But first I would think of Wilson's. Now, if as you know, diagnosis of Wilson's would be by seeing the KF ring and urine 24-hour copper and serum ceruloplasmin, and you can also see the in the liver biopsy dry copper weight being high. And but what if we do not have these facilities? If I just give you an LFT, can you make a diagnosis of Wilson's in that? Let's say if a child is having renal failure, you cannot collect 24-hour urine copper in that copper sample for that in 24-hour urine, because the child is in ARF, not passing urine. Is there any other way that we can diagnose Wilson's? This is classical that you can KF ring. KF ring can be found in any other autoimmune hepatitis also. KF ring can be present in any other chronic liver disease also. 24-hour urine copper might not be reliable when you are having renal failure kind of a situation. So here you are left with only serum ceruloplasmin, but only one marker is not enough to diagnose Wilson's. You need at least, out of these 3 3, if you have 2 markers positive, then you can call it as Wilson's. But what if you cannot do all this?
Family history and consanguinity can be helpful in making the diagnosis.
I'm giving you LFT only.
SGPT would be severely raised as compared to SGOT.
No, it's the other way around.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. Yes, exactly, it's the other way around.
It's the other way around.
I'm sorry.
So I'll just tell you what it is. If the OTPT ratio is more than 2.2, or maybe just remember 2, if OT is double than the PT, then first think of Wilson's. And another thing, as the time passes by, the alkaline phosphatase and total ratio of alkaline phosphatase by total bilirubin, if it is falling below 4, this is 100% Wilson's. As you can see in this our case, at 4 p.m. or just compare the OTPTs from 4 p.m. to 2 a.m. 794, 379, double, here also double, here also double. In all these 3 samples, OTPTs were more than 2, right? And the other ratio that I've told you, alkaline phosphatase by bilirubin ratio, here it was 12, then it fell to 6, and in the sample of 2 a.m. it fell below 4. So here the diagnosis of Wilson's was totally made. And so what we can learn from here is that if we do not have the final diagnostic methods that we can apply, and we do not have time to do that even, then still we can come to a diagnosis. But even if we come to a diagnosis, we cannot help the child in getting treated, because this is not the phase in which we can give penicillin to the child. And we cannot actually do anything. D-penicillin cannot be given at this, because acute liver failure child cannot be given D-penicillin because it worsens the situation in itself. Here, if we there's only choice is the liver transplant. There is no other choice that you can take here. So so learning point here is that if you have these 2 criteria being positive, SGOTPT more than 2, and alkaline phosphatase and total bilirubin ratio less than 4, there's 100% sensitivity and specificity that this diagnosis would be a Wilson's. Now in the next case, 2-day-old child with deep jaundice, and this full-term normal delivery, no consanguineous marriage, there's no consanguinity, and weight of 3.5 kg, hepatosplenomegaly, bilirubin of 31. What would be the diagnosis here? Do you remember those 4 diagnoses that I told? 2-day-old child, less than 1 month, there are 4 diagnoses that you should always remember. GSD4, tyrosinemia, galactosemia, and iron storage disorders, or neonatal hemochromatosis. Any guess out of these 4, what would be the best diagnosis here?
Tyrosinemia.
Tyrosinemia will not have bilirubin of 31 on day 2. Then remains galactosemia. Galactosemia also will not have this kind of a picture. GSD4 will have acute liver failure. Yes, that can be one of the situations. But more than that, very high bilirubin on very, very early in life, best diagnosis out of these 4 would be hemochromatosis, neonatal hemochromatosis. And to diagnose that, as I said, there is other diagnosis also. HLH can be there, sepsis can be there. So that also should be kept in mind. Child so early, sepsis presenting so early, sepsis should always be ruled out, HLH should always be ruled out, and all these 4 diagnoses should also be kept in mind.
Sir, would HLH present alone with the hepatomegaly? It won't be present with splenomegaly?
Yeah, that's again going against it. But child with liver failure with so high bilirubin, HLH can be one of the differentials, but not that high. First would be the metabolic liver disorder, then HLH, and sepsis would be higher than HLH, I would say. So what came out
in 2 days old child sepsis? 2 days old child sepsis leading to such a deep jaundice. Will there be any possibility?
That goes against 31 bilirubin goes against that. the child can have conjugated bilirubin, high bilirubins, but will not have 31, 41. That kind of a picture is not there. So one diagnosis that is very, very classically seen is hemochromatosis. So that should be kept in mind. Very, very early presentation, hemochromatosis would be the best diagnosis. If you see
Dr. Ajay Kumar sir, just one query here.
Yeah.
Can we think of hydrops fetalis as pediatricians? We would think of hydrops fetalis or RH incompatibility initially, because the direct indirect was not dispelled there. Due to 31 bilirubin hepatomegaly.
So if we do not
Hydrops will have,
but if we do not
the
have
hydrops will have the primary presentation of hydrops, and second
cardiac failure
presentation of jaundice, rather than primarily presenting as jaundice and secondarily other signs of hydrops.
the features of hydrops will be there then, which will catch the diagnosis. Edematous, severely edematous child and all, severely anemic, cardiac problems and all, those kind of presentation will be there in hydrops. Here the child is okay, non-consanguineous, weight is fine, good looking child, but having such a high bilirubin. So what we did, the investigations, hemoglobin was 13, TLC was high, platelets were low, bilirubin was 41. In the next investigations, OTPTs were okay, not okay, but on a higher side, and INR was 2.1, so going into failure. GGT here you can say it is 40, but catching the GGT here and saying that this is PFIC would not be the right approach, because PFIC would not present so early and will not be so severe in that terms, that the bilirubin will rise to 30, 31, 40s. And you can see ferritin being high, 4,000. Triglycerides of 120 kind of rules out HLH. Fibrinogen of 120 again kinds of rules out HLH. So serum iron on a higher side, transferrin saturation on the lower side. So this high iron with low transferrin and ferritin of very high ferritin gives us the diagnosis of neonatal hemochromatosis. Now, you can also diagnose by doing a buccal mucosa biopsy, but because the child would be bleeding and all, so nobody takes that risk of diagnosing from there. There are other simple modalities like an MRI can suggest an iron deposits in the heart, liver, pancreas, and kidneys. And but again, MRI is not available everywhere. So simple LFTs and some simple ferritin and all iron studies can give us a picture of what is happening. So neonatal hemochromatosis should always be kept in mind. But here the treatment is different. It is not liver transplant. This neonatal hemochromatosis is kind of an alloimmune reaction in which this kind of presentation happens. So plasmapheresis can help, IVIG can help, and some cocktail of antioxidants you can give. But the prognosis of these kids is very bad. Hardly, they do not. It's very difficult for them to survive in such a scenario, and they usually, die. Now, moving on to the next case. This is an 8-month-old child who had ALF and was dengue IgM positive, and had been having persistent vomiting, irritability, and poor weight gain since 6 months of age. This was referred to us because the child had persistent hypoglycemia and a huge, large liver was there. This all can be explained by dengue itself, because dengue can cause liver failure and can have all sorts of liver-related issues. But persistence of hypoglycemia in a huge liver was a concerning thing, for which we thought there might be some metabolic liver disorder going on. So in this scenario, what would come to mind? An 8-month-old child who has been complaining, that mother complaining since 6 months of life the child has been irritable and poor weight gain has been there, hypoglycemia has been noted. what could be the possibility? It can still, if we rule out all, if we do not consider the huge hepatomegaly or hypoglycemia, this all can be explained by dengue itself. I would tell you that the first lab investigations showed alpha-fetoprotein being high, that the diagnosis of thalassemia was made, and then simultaneously the samples were sent to the other lab, and the PCR was positive and NPD was made. But either of these diagnoses were not there finally. The diagnosis here is hereditary fructose intolerance. Here what happens is aldose B deficiency happens and liver and kidney damage happens. The catching point here is the child started having all this failure to thrive, irritability, persistent vomitings after 6 months of life. When the child was into fruits and sugary things, and complementary food was started. So once you start introducing fruits in the diet of a child who's having hereditary fructose intolerance, suddenly the child starts becoming sicker and shows intolerance to fruits and all, and has persistent vomiting, growth failures, liver failures, and later on, if the exposure keeps going on and on and on, the child might get kidney damage and all. So the learning lesson here is history taking should be good. Sometimes just the history can give you the diagnosis rather than the lab investigation. One thing more I would like to emphasize here is that even if you get a diagnosis in your lab investigations, the investigations are not the final answer. Sometimes diagnosis changes after years. The diagnosis changes to something else in a liver metabolic disorder. I remember a case in which the child had hepatosplenomegaly and pancytopenia. We did a bone marrow and Gaucher cells were there. We made a diagnosis of Gaucher's disease. But after 5-6 years of life, the child had come back again in a very disabled, decorticate situation, neurological. Over these years, the child had gone into regression of milestones, developmental delays, all sorts of neurological problems. And that point of time, the diagnosis changed to NPD. So the liver metabolic disorder is such that even if your investigation are proving something, with time only you might be sure what the diagnosis is. So it can keep changing as the time goes by. And if you send a set of samples to one lab, you might get some other kind of reports. In the other lab, you get some other kind of reports. So that's why I just presented this case. That is not only the investigation that you should be looking at. You should be following up the child and seeing what is going on, whether there are new symptoms that are developing, whether the child is okay, whether it's actually improving to the treatment. So that was the point. Now, galactosemia. Galactosemia is of 3 types. Galactose 1, the GALT deficiency. Type 2 is galactokinase deficiency, and type 3 is of hyperomerase deficiency. Here, I would not want you to remember all this. I would just give you type 1 and type 3 usually present with liver problems and cataract, whereas type 2 has only cataract, nothing else. And these kids present early on in life, maybe first 6 months of life, and they are usually missed because they keep they are being treated for infection multiple times. E. coli sepsis is the most common presenting feature in these kids. They usually develop E. coli sepsis, E. coli UTI. I would tell you a child who had come to me like I would say 1 month back from Kashmir, and he was around 40-day-old child, was having bilirubin of 20 initially, which went up to 27. And I had a discussion with him, and he said कि sir अगर कोई diagnosis है तो बताओ. मैंने कहा I think it is galactosemia based on nothing, I would say. He said कि सर कुछ ऐसा है कि जो डाइट में चेंज कर सकते हैं. मैंने कहा मेटाबॉलिक लीवर डिसऑर्डर्स में आप एक चीज कर सकते हो, आप अपना लैक्टोज एक्सपोजर बंद करके देखो, मे बी दैट विल हेल्प. एंड he actually did it, and for past 1 month he is not giving anything to the child in form of galactose, like lactose free diet karna hota. I mean, it's like just any of the lactose free formula you can use, and just changed that, not on any basis of any investigation, that still not proven that it is galactosemia. Today we got the report of that gene exome. It also says it's negative. There is no galactosemia or any metabolic liver disorders, but the child had 27 bilirubin. The child had lactic acidosis, lactate of 40, and the child did not have cataract. Usually cataract is present, but maybe he might develop later on if he keeps getting exposed to galactose. And hemolysis was there. When he came to the hospital, his bilirubin was 5 and his DCT was positive. So hemolytic anemia, you can see here, hemolysis, hypoglycemia, jaundice, liver disease, lactic acidosis, cataract, and retrotubular acidosis. Out of these, he has hemolysis, he has hypoglycemia, there was episodes of hypoglycemia, there was jaundice, there is a liver disease, there is lactic acidosis, but there is no cataract. Renal tubular acidosis, still he is not developed, too young to get that, and he has had documented E. coli sepsis in our hospital also, and was diagnosed as having E. coli earlier before he came to the hospital. But his gene mutation does not prove galactosemia. But again, he was put on galactose-free diet, to which he responded, and now the last investigations, his bilirubin was 27, it fell to 9 in the last investigation. The child is doing well, eating well, growing well now, but the diagnosis, even the genetic mutation hasn't proved that it is galactosemia. But from my gut feeling, I feel it is galactosemia only. Maybe the lab report is erroneous, or maybe we need to do the whole exome rather than this, because what you get in gene exome sequencing, you get a set of more common genetic mutations that for that disease, but there are more than that mutations that we know of. If I say there are 10 mutations of this particular disease, there might be hundreds of them which we are not aware of. So for me, clinical picture is more important. So if the child has been improving with certain things, like in this, we just changed the diet to lactose free diet, and the child improved and started in 1 month, 27 to 9, the child has improved. Bilirubin has come down, he's improving, has no edema, his albumin is increasing, his INR is improving, he's now absolutely fine. Even if I don't have a diagnosis proven by even the genetic mutations, I will still not go by that. I would more go by my gut feeling that probably this is the diagnosis, because something we did, we actually improved. Now there can be a discussion that one of his doctors is making with me, who's in Kashmir. He tells me that when this all can be explained by infection, why are you getting after him and not stopping his lactose exposure? And I said 2 times he has got E. coli sepsis only, which is proven to be in galactosemia. Why not just go with that itself? But there's a difference of opinion. I might be wrong in that, but I don't have the proof of it. But the clinical picture does, go into favor of that. But we do not have the final diagnosis as of now. So just wanted to emphasize that even after the investigation is not proving it, go by your clinical judgment and your experience. Probably you might be right. You might save a life. You might save a transplant. Because if galactosemia child keeps taking galactose, he will end up into having a transplant. Now, we just stopped it. He will never need a transplant. If he just keeps him on his diet, and if my diagnosis is okay, he will never need a transplant. So it's more of weighing what would be best for the child. Now coming to the next group of metabolic liver disorders is GSD, glycogen storage disorders. Usually type 1, 3, 4, and 6 and 9 present with hepatic problems. In type 1 can present, I would say, what kind of patients I have. They usually present at middle age of infant, I would say 3 or 4 years of age, or even later on, 5, 6 years of age, with a child coming with short stature, with some kind of developmental delay, hepatomegaly. And classically, if you find a child, child's mother saying कि इसको सुबह सुबह दौरे पड़ते हैं, early morning seizures, and some stout kind of hands and feet, short stature, hypoglycemia. This is a classical picture of a GSD1 child. So a child showing features of early morning seizures, hypoglycemia, short stature, and hepatomegaly, I would suspect GSD1 if the child is presenting at around 5 to 7 years of age. The classical point about this is that there is no fibrosis. If you look at the liver biopsy, you will never find a fibrosis in this, in a child with GSD1. Why? Because the collected galactogen is a normal one. It is not abnormal. So it will never cause fibrosis. It will only cause increase in size of the liver, and the hepatomegaly, huge hepatomegaly can happen. So a child who's having isolated hepatomegaly, GSD1 should be kept in mind. But glycogen storage disorder should be kept in mind. And if you do a liver biopsy and you don't find a fibrosis, it's straight away, and you find some galactose, glycogen storage cells and balloon cells and all, you got your diagnosis. It's probably GSD1. Because of this huge hepatomegaly, adenomas do develop in these children. There's one problem in managing the other part of the GSD, and that is the hypertriglyceridemia that happens with them. You probably sometime need to start with medicines for hypertriglyceridemias, and uric acid is high in these kids. So these other manifestations create more problem in managing these children rather than the primary diagnosis. Hypertriglyceridemia, uric acid being high cause a lot of problem, and the best way to manage these kids is just to give cornstarch and continuously keep giving it. Every 2 to 3 hours, if you keep giving cornstarch to the child, he will not get into hypoglycemia, he will not have seizures. And overnight also in US and UK, what they do is they keep an NG, and the continuous infusion of cornstarch feed is going on. But in Indian children, it is not really required. If you give them cornstarch feed every 2 to 3 hours, that will be more than enough, and that can be managed. And those children who are actually on cornstarch feeding every 2-3 hours, they are doing good. They develop well. The neurological development becomes better. They tend to get better very soon if you are able to catch these children. But most important and the most difficult part to manage is the adenoma, the hypertriglyceridemia, the uric acid being high. So this needs more of a specific diagnosis. Not the diagnosis, but the management. And difference between GSD1 and GSD3 is that GSD3 is a milder form of the same thing. An enzyme is obviously different, but here if you do a biopsy, the fibrosis is there. So if you have a fibrosis, then the diagnosis would probably be of GSD3, not GSD1. And GSD4, if you talk about GSD4, the classical one point if you want to remember about this is the cirrhosis happens in infancy. This is one of the 4 diagnoses that I've been telling you throughout this presentation. GSD4, tyrosinemia, galactosemia, and iron storage disorders. This is the 4th thing in the whole presentation. GSD4 did not come. Any child in first 1 month having acute liver failure, but if you do a biopsy, if you get an opportunity to do a biopsy and you find cirrhotic changes in the liver, then the diagnosis becomes GSD4. So throughout this presentation, I have tried to give you a picture of all those 4 the typical findings of all those 4 diagnoses, how to differentiate, what can you do, and this was the last one. So GSD4 also has come into the picture, and now let's move on. So GSD1, no fibrosis, GSD3 fibrosis, and cirrhosis in GSD4. This is what you can remember this much. I'll be more than happy. Now in this next case, this is 1 year 9-month-old child who presented with abdominal distension. There was no jaundice, there was hepatomegaly, splenomegaly, and there were rickets. Now what would be the best diagnosis here? Any guesses? 1 year 9-month-old child, abdominal distension, but no jaundice, hepatosplenomegaly, rickets. Generally, what would be thinking? I mean, rickets is there, malnutrition. Even PEM patients can have all this. Abdominal distension can be there, hepatosplenomegaly can be there, rickets can be there. There would not be any jaundice, of course. So that is one thing that we can have. Sometimes HIV with malnutrition can be there. Even rickets, for that matter, even normal rickets can cause such kind of a presentation. Because in rickets, the abdominal, the liver and spleen can be pushed down because of the malformation in the chest. These are the 2 diagnoses. But what would be the metabolic liver disease that we can think in this situation? 1 year 9-month-old child. Now we have gone beyond the infancy, and child presents with abdominal distension, hepatosplenomegaly, rickets. As I told you in the early part of my presentation, rickets is one of the features of metabolic liver disorders. So what would be coming to the mind? Here I would think of tyrosinemia. So as I've discussed, rickets, HIV, malnutrition, and tyrosinemia. And vitamin D, as you can see, was normal, HIV was negative, LFT showed derangement, VBG had acidosis, so that rickets, and there's rickets and now acidosis is there, so renal tubular acidosis is there. Alpha-fetoprotein was found to be raised, urine succinylcholine aldosterone was found to be raised, and so this gives us a diagnosis that this kind of presentation can also be there, in which you do not need to have jaundice. This hepatosplenomegaly, malnutrition like child, malnourished looking child, rickets. Do keep metabolic liver disorders in mind. And this was the case of a tyrosinemia. So if you look into presentation of a tyrosinemic child, it can present in various ways. I mean, this is one of the ways that it can present, that I've shown the case, but it can present as acute liver failure, it can present as chronic liver failure, CLD, it can present as only RTA, and because of the metabolites getting clogged inside the liver and damaging the liver cells, they can also present as hepatocellular carcinomas. Porphyry-like illness can be there. So there are various kind of presentations. So tyrosinemia is not just the presentation that I've made. It can be neonatal cholestasis, can be a presentation of tyrosinemia. It can be a normal CLD kind picture. If you have rickets, RTAs, that can be there. And even if a child, if you find who's having HCC, do rule out this. And porphyry-like illness. So remember this if possible, because I can understand it's so much information that I'm giving. It's very hard to grasp all of this. And the treatment of choice in tyrosinemia would be NTBC, which is not available in India. It is a drug that has to be given daily, once a day. And if we are able to catch the children in their infancy, in the early part of the infancy, if you start the treatment with NTBC, nothing happens. Child becomes absolutely fine. There's no need for transplant. But if you find the diagnosis to be later on after maybe 1 year of life, usually they end up going into transplants. The NTBC won't work at that point of time. There are various other metabolic liver disorders like mitochondrial disorders, urea cycle defects, propionemic acidemias, methylmalonic acidemias, Crick-Mills syndromes, MSUD. Now, first 4 or 5 of these usually will present with neurological problems. And primary hyperaldosteronuria, lysosomal disorders, NPD. I'm not going to detail of all that because of the time constraint and not to confuse you. The message that I wanted to give was try and think of metabolic liver disorders not in just cases which have only cholestasis. You can think in cases of rickets, in cases having neurological problems, failure to thrive, consanguinity, sibling deaths, and we might end to a diagnosis, but it's very difficult to come to a final diagnosis. Really difficult, I'm telling you. It's been very, very difficult for us to get to the final diagnosis, and sometimes diagnosis keeps changing with time. Over years, as I mentioned, initially the diagnosis was something else and then became something else, and we have to just keep in mind that if we are able to pick up metabolic liver disorders, they can be helped by proper guidance, proper referrals, and maybe most of them might land up into liver transplant. But that's getting a liver transplant nowadays is not that difficult, I would say. It was very, very difficult in, I think, maybe 7-10 years back. Now picture has changed. Even if you think of liver transplant, costing, as I told you, first thing, if you talk of costing, various centers offer various kind of packages. Usually the pediatric liver transplant happens in around 15 to 16 lakhs, and but there are various agencies that have come up. There are 3-4 fundraising companies that are there which help the children, and we have done a lot of transplants in almost like free. Nothing has gone from their pockets, and the fundraising happens in 15-20 days. They do a lot of hard work. They go on Facebook, they go on all social media, they could talk to celebrities, and they get a lot of funding. And a lot of transplants we have done, and they've been successful, and not a penny has been spent. And on the follow-up also, they get the support, not just for that 15-20 days of transplant in which they get the support. Later on, so they get the support. So the financial part of liver transplant is, I would say, out of the picture in current scenario. So finances do not cause hindrance in transplant. It is more of donation, the willing to donate. The parents should be ready. One of the parents has to come up and say, okay, I'll donate. But the problem when we talk of transplant, the first thing that comes up in mind is no, who is going to donate? The fathers are actually not allowed from the parents side. Okay, लड़का है, अरे इसको तो और भी होना है, इसको तो काम करना है, इसको कहाँ कटवा रहे हो, इसको कहाँ लीवर डोनेट करा रहे हो, लड़के को क्यों करा रहे हो? तो first the father is out of the picture most of the times. That's what, if you look into the data, most of the times it's the mother that goes under the knife and becomes the donor. But even the mothers are most of the times not ready to give the liver to their own child. Most of the times, that's what I'm saying. Most of the times, I'll repeat it, most of the times we do not find the willingness to donate, because there are reasons to that. The reason is probably that the parents think that we can have another kid, let this kid go. Why to face, why to put myself on risk? Why to put so much of money? Why to take this risk? We can have another child. We are young. We can have another child. This child is in many ways 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, maybe maximum 1 year old child. They are ready to go away with the child, and their mental thinking is like aur bachcha kar lenge, isko chhod. And that's the problem. But these kids have a very good result. Those kids who have undergone transplant, we've done almost like 300 transplants in our center, and the success rate for first 1 year is 95%, and for 5-year survival is like 87%. So it's very good results, and we've been doing retransplants also, and so in lockdown also we were very busy with the transplant thing going on. Here we have a picture of 10 kids who underwent transplant after the lockdown, and all of them made it successfully. And this is a picture of 10 transplants. We had published this, and during the lockdowns we did this, but after this picture we've already done 7 or 8 more transplants. So look, here I would like to finish my presentation, and open the house for further questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
I think Dr. Vikram has practically summarized everything. And I have a small query which is a little different from just the diagnosis of metabolic disorder. It is regarding the management. Mm-hmm. That is treatment of bleeding. If the INR is very high in a patient of hepatic failure, what can be the approach? Because the factors will not be helpful to that extent. Vitamin K and all is practically not going to work. So how will we approach towards such a case of massive bleeding?
See, the first point is that if a child is having INR of 4, it's a direct indication to an emergency transplant. No matter how much blood you FFP or anything you give, the child is going to keep bleeding. Because the child starts going into what happens actually is if a child comes to an encephalopathy with the INR of 7, 8 and is bleeding from everywhere, it is practically impossible to stop the bleeding. And giving FFP and bloods and all those things overloads the hemodynamics, and that pushes more towards more bleeding. And it's a difficult situation. Even if you give vitamin K or whatsoever, it does not change. Situation never changes. It's only the transplant that can, revert the situation. Yes, in Wilson's, I would say plasmapheresis has shown promising results in which acute liver failure child can undergo sessions of plasmapheresis, and can get out of the situation. And later on, if the child fortunately survives through the plasmapheresis, later on can be started on chelation therapy and all, and sometimes they do recover.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. There is one question from Dr. Ayush Rastogi. Dr. Ayush, please unmute yourself and ask directly to Vikram sir. He has asked about the liver biopsy versus...
Good evening, sir. Sir, my question was in the case of cystic fibrosis, you told the role of liver biopsy. So I was just wanting to know what is the role of CFTR gene sequence versus IRT. There was a patient who had a very high IRT, a neonate who had small bowel syndrome, and who was supposedly, we thought to be cystic fibrosis. His IRT was of the charts, it was 3000 something, which I remember, and the CFTR gene sequence came out to be negative.
The problem with that CFTR gene mutation is that the mutation is you cannot predict what kind of mutation they would be testing and what kind of mutation is there in the child itself. So sweat chloride test, CFTR mutations needs to be done. And
sir, sorry, sir. Please continue, sir.
So liver biopsy as such, as I said, will not be helpful unless the liver is involved. And in liver biopsy, you might find inspissated bile, which is classical finding for cystic fibrosis.
So then what to do next if we are suspecting cystic fibrosis in this baby? Then the sweat chloride test would not be possible in a baby who is around 1 month.
Sometimes you are stuck with such problems where you do not get the final diagnosis, but you are, as I told in my case, the child I am following with my presumption that the child has galactosemia, but even the genetic mutation has not proven that. So I would say in metabolic liver disorders, almost like 50 to 60% times you go by your instinct and do what is best and the best probable diagnosis, and accordingly you would like to manage, rather than just waiting for the investigations to prove your diagnosis or disprove your diagnosis. And again, I would reiterate the same thing: don't go by the investigations. They might be falsely positive or give you a wrong direction, go by your clinical judgment and treat the best possible diagnosis rather than waiting for the investigations to give you a direction.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Dr.
Uh,
TR, I
Yes,
would
sir.
say excellent presentation. Excellent
Thank you.
presentation, because this was in the form of a conversation and backed up by beautiful cases. And he honestly said it is such a topic, everybody was scared of it. So that was the best way to convey it like a conversation. And those most interested, they have stuck up to the last moments of the session. So excellent work, Dr. Vikram. I would like to know what are the common reasons for which these liver transplantation are being done in infants especially.
Most commonly, as I said, it is the biliary atresia. I would say 2/3 of the cases are only biliary atresia, and 20 to 30% are undiagnosed metabolic liver disorders or diagnosed metabolic liver disorders, and the rest, sometimes it is, as I told, organic acidemias or Crigler-Najjar syndrome. In these propionic acidemias, MSUD, these are the more likely diagnoses that we have.
Okay, thank you very much. Right.
Thank you, sir. I really
Are
appreciate.
there any further questions?
Is there any question from the audience?
Are any further questions by anyone?
No question.
So there are no questions. I would just basically it's a wonderful presentation by Dr. which made most of us dazzled way he thinks. It was clinical rather than patient. In brief, there is a factory which he affected and it can show damage itself as on others. And it is, as a clinician, very important for not to diagnose them early, but to suspect them early. If we are able to suspect, diagnosis can be made either by or maybe by the gastrophysician. If we are not to suspect them, not refer them to the center and they not get the treatment at the proper. And there are certain like country death, recurrent episodes of jaundice, developmental delay, organomegaly, rickets, and failure to thrive with hypomania, and all these presentations are. And of course, we know most of the presentations of various illnesses, and certain we must remember in mind that early treatment leave various ways by which we can at least prevent further damage to the liver. It is very important for us to diagnose conditions like hereditary fructose intolerance, because where we find that the child is not getting fruits, the child is doing perfectly well, and later on is presenting with failure to thrive and other presentation of liver diseases. So this is one thing which can, if we are constantly plotting the growth chart, we can easily make out that something is going wrong, and maybe it is the fruits which are causing problems. If we are suspecting that, we can refer the patient, or at least we can withdraw fruits from the diet. And same is for galactosemia. He has highlighted it in a very nice way that recurrent E. coli sepsis, if we are getting, maybe in the form of UTI, we should suspect galactosemia, and if there are other presentations of liver damages, and we should withdraw galactose. If we are not able to diagnose and confirm it, we should withdraw galactose from the diet. This is totally a clinical type of suspicion and a clinical type of management, rather than waiting and letting the patient deteriorate. Similarly, the ratio between OT and PT, which is very important, and in Wilson, and ALP to total bilirubin level, which should be less than 4 in most of these cases. GSD is another condition which can be diagnosed or it cannot be confirmed. It can be suspected so easily, and early morning fits and hypoglycemia may be the presentation because early morning fasting, hypoglycemia is quite common. And the management is also very simple. You need not go for all that molecular diagnosis, especially if the patient cannot afford it. We can keep on giving cornstarch feeds every 2 to 3 hours, and if we are able to manage the patient on that, I mean, it is good enough for at least those who cannot afford for detailed diagnosis. Tyrosinemia may be having various presentation, and certain liver diseases presents primarily as neurological presentation. So we should not be scared of liver transplant, and liver transplant may be very much in the hands of people, even for those who can afford it, provided there is a willingness to donate the liver. Thank you very much, Dr. Vikram. It was such a wonderful presentation, and we are highly obliged to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your nice words, and hopefully we'll continue this association in future also. And probably from next week, I'll be coming to Lucknow for doing an OPD with Dr. Chawla's in Dr. Chawla's clinic. So if you have any cases that can be referred and I can see, I'll be more happy than in helping the kids and helping get to the final diagnosis and proper management.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Vikram.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
विक्रम सर, आपने तो दिल जीत लिया. मुझे लगा था कि काफी बोर होंगे हम लोग.
मेरे को आपसे ज्यादा मुझे तो लग रहा था
नहीं कि शायद बोर हो जाएंगे. और जनरल पीडियाट्रिशियन को लगता है कि मेटाबॉलिक लिवर डिजीज डायग्नोसिस बनाना ही बड़ा टफ है. तो लेकिन आपने इतना अच्छे से और इतने ही बेहतर ढंग से प्रेजेंट किया और टू द पॉइंट, इतना शार्ट, इतना क्लिनिकल प्रेजेंटेशन शायद मैं पहली बार सुन रहा हूँ. दिस इज द फर्स्ट टाइम आई हैव लिसन so clear, so clinically oriented presentation. Thank you so much, sir, for joining this our platform and highlighting all these things in a very minute and very clear way. So thank on behalf of Lucknow Academy of Pediatrics, I am really thankful to Dr. Sanjay Ranger sir, Chawla sir, and I think he has left Nigam Prakash sir and Dr. Baldev Gupta sir and all these team member of the lab who has joined this program. I am really thankful to all of you. And please, Dr. Anurag sir has recorded this program and we will post on the Facebook also. And I think we can post on the YouTube channel also, sir. Huh? Anurag sir? Yeah. Now Lucknow Academy Pediatrics is totally digital, and those who have left this very important topic, they will listen later on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to all of you.
Dr. T.R. Yadav, my request, Dr. T.R. Yadav, my request to Dr. Ajay Kumar. He is very well summarized the take-home points. That summary can be posted on WhatsApp.
सर का पूरा रिकॉर्ड हो गया.
Dr. Ajay Kumar.
हाँ सर, डॉक्टर अजय ने तो पूरा एक लाइन में ही पूरी प्रेजेंटेशन खत्म कर दी सर आपने.
सर तो बिल्कुल गुरु है, इसीलिए तो मैंने सर को कहा था सर ही समराइज करेंगे.
मैं 1 घंटे तक बोलता रहा, आपने वो एक लाइन में बोल दिया. बोले यार क्या बेकार.
Yes, समराइज very well, and all things is recorded and anyone, any member can listen it later on also. I am really thankful to Ajay sir for doing so nicely, and Vikram sir, we will invite you again on this platform in future also.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you sir.
Thank you.
And Happy New Year to all.